Alright, so because I am not at school today, I made a quick video about the second section of 7.5 Part 2. And so we're going to go ahead and put the period number, and today is 5/5. Happy Cinco de Mayo. And so this is a continuation of what we covered yesterday. So yesterday we were looking at when we have a trinomial, we were factoring it to figure out the two factors. And so we would be left with a binomial times a binomial, and that would be our final answer. And so the way that we are doing things today, though, is not only are we arriving at two binomials, but it's going to be set up as an equation. So now it's going to look like what we did in 7.4, when you had to figure out what are the value of x's that make each factor equal to 0. So if you remember, if you cover up the second factor and just look at the first one, what does the value of x need to be so that when I add 3 to it, it equals 0? Well, that would be -3. And then when I look at this one, what number minus 6 gives us a value of 0? And that would be 6. So my answers to an equation like this would be x is -3 and +6. And then the second example over here, we would see that x would be 4 to make this factor 0. And x would be -8 to make this factor 0. Because remember, if we make one of the factors 0, anything times 0 is 0. So my answers on this one would be x equals 4 and x equals -8. Well, we're not going to be at this step yet today until we actually do the factoring. So when we start with this, we're going to do just what we did yesterday. You're going to make two parentheses. That's the first thing we're going to do every single time. And remember, this first term just splits in two. So what multiplies to make x squared? Well, that's x and x. And then we take the philosophy of what two numbers multiply to make the c value, which is -18, but add together to make the b value, which is -3. And so just like yesterday, we made our factors, the two numbers that multiply to make -18, but add to make -3. And because the middle term is negative, we know that the bigger of the two factors has to carry the negative sign. So down here, when I do 2 times 9, the 9 actually has to be negative. And if I choose 3 times 6, it has to be negative. Now we also could have done, 1 times -18. But we kind of realize right away that's not going to be even close to -3 when we add them. But they are factors, so we'll go ahead and write them down. So then between these three different sets of factors, all three sets of these multiply to make -18, but only one set down here actually adds to make -3. And so that's going to give us our answer when we do x plus 3, because the 3 is positive, and then x minus 6. That's negative. But I'm not done, because look at what was left. This whole thing is set equal to 0. So now the next step today that we are doing is deciding, well, what values make each factor equal to 0. So just like we saw up here in the first example, we knew that when x is -3 and when x is +6, those are the answers that make this equation true. And that's what we have down here. So from here through here to this line right here, this is what we did yesterday. We're just doing one extra step to solve the equation. Okay? So now we're going to run through some examples. And so some of these examples are already set equal to 0. But then you'll see in examples 3 and 4, we're actually going to have to move some numbers around to get everything on one side of the equation. And we'll get that in a second. So x squared minus 13x plus 40. I'm going to make my two parentheses. I'm going to go x and x. The last number is positive, so both numbers that I multiply together to make 40 have to be the same sign. Because the middle term is negative, both numbers have to be negative. So I'm thinking I have -1 and -40. So the factors of 40, we have -1 and -40. We can go -2 and -20. and we can go -4 and -10, or -5 and -8. But remember, our goal here is not only to figure out which two multiply to make +40, but also which ones add together to make -13. And so the ones that you'll figure is the last group right here, the -5 and the -8. So as I fill these in with -5 and -8, remember this whole thing is still set equal to 0. So now we have the additional step of what value of x makes the first factor 0, and what value of x makes the second factor 0. And so what number -5 is 0? We get 5. What number -8 is 0? We get 8. And so our final answer is going to be x equals 5 and x equals 8. So again, everything's the same as yesterday until we get to here, and now we figure out what are the value of x's. So let's run through number 2. We start with our first two parentheses. We take the first term and split it up, so k squared becomes k times k. Now just like this one, when we had a negative sign in the middle and a positive c term, same situation here. So the two numbers that multiply to make 6, they both have to be negative, so that we can get a negative sign here, but a positive result here. So if you think about your factors of 6, we have -1 and -6, and we have -2 and -3. I need to choose the one that gives me a sum of -5, and that's going to be this group right here. So we fill in our binomials with the -2 and the -3, but again, it's still set equal to 0. So the last step is, what makes this binomial equal to 0, and what makes this binomial equal to 0. And so our two numbers that make this equation true are when k is 2 and when k is 3. Alright, so far so good. Well, this is when they both started equal to 0. There's a slight difference on the last two examples that we're going to cover. Right now, this equation does not equal 0. In fact, we can't factor this right now until I get everything on one side of the equal sign. So I need this 30 to move over to the left. So if it's a positive 30 already, I have to subtract it to the other side. So remember, what we do to one side, we do to the other. The x squared stays the same. The minus x stays the same. Well, now we also have a -30. On the other side, these two 30s add together and create our 0. So now we're at the same step we were up here with these two. So let's follow what we already learned. Two parentheses. Split the x. What two numbers multiply to make -30, but add to make -1? Remember, the only way you can multiply to get a negative product is if one's positive and one's negative. But if the middle term's negative, the bigger of the two factors has to carry the negative sign. So if I do my factors of 30, here are all my possibilities. I need the bigger numbers to carry the negative sign. So all these sets multiply to make -30, but which of them actually give me a sum of -1? And it's this pair down here. So that puts me at +5 and -6. And then what values make both factors equal to 0? For the first factor, -5. For the second factor, +6. So x in this question equals -5 and 6. Okay. All right, last example. I don't have the equation set equal to 0, so I have to move this term right here. So we're going to add 2 to both sides. So r squared minus 3r, none of that's changed. All I've done is added a 2 to that side of the equation, and then it sets equal to 0. So now what numbers, as I set this up, r and r, what numbers multiply to make +2, but add to make -3? Well, to get a positive result, remember both factors have to be the same sign. Since the middle term's negative, I need both numbers to be negative. My only option, there's only one set of factors that make 2, so it's going to be -1 and -2. The whole thing's still set equal to 0. So what makes the first factor 0? When r is 1 or when r is 2. So my answers are 1 and 2. So now as you turn the page on this, what you're going to see are 12 equations on the back side, and you get the rest of the class time to work on these 12 equations. Okay? If it's not already set equal to 0, you have to move that number to the left side first, and then you're going to factor, and then find the values of the variable that make the equation equal to 0. Okay? All right, I will see you guys on Monday. Have a good weekend.